Should have split that up a little bit, huh? You sure? Looks like it says blind drunk booze during Prohibition, as opposed to blind drunk booze during Prohibition. Whatever.
Ready to go, Jonathan?
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Schaumburg Library. My name is Chris. I'm your programs coordinator here at the library, and I am super excited to be with you guys tonight. This is actually my second time working with tonight's speaker, so I know that you guys are in for a real treat this evening. Before I formally introduce the speaker and pass the evening over to him, just a few friendly reminders for our in-person audience and our at-home audience. For our at-home audience, you'll notice that your microphones and your cameras have been turned off. If you're experiencing any technical difficulties during this evening's program, please use the Q&A function. That's the easiest way for me to go back and forth with you specifically and help you with whatever problem it is. I can't promise I have the answer, but I'll try my hardest to help you. You can also turn on closed captions if you would like, and if you have any questions for tonight's presenter, make sure to pop those in the Q&A as well. Throw them in as we go along. We'll address questions at the end of this evening's presentation. But make sure you're doing that as we go so you don't forget anything. And speaking of Q&A for our in-person audience, I know a lot of you have been here at a previous hybrid program, so you know the drill at this point. If you have a question at the end of tonight's presentation for today's speaker, please raise your hand high and proud so I can bring my little microphone here to your mouth so that our at-home audience can hear what you're asking the speaker. So just don't be ashamed, throw your hand up, I will run over to you. Also, please take this time to silence all cell phones and any other electronic device that may make noise.
That's a good call. Yeah, that's a real good call.
I think last week my presenter's phone went off in the middle of their presentation, so good call.
Good call.
So please take this time to turn off all of those. You guys at home, we can't hear it, but hey, maybe you don't want yourself distracted. Nice time to put that on silent and lose yourself in some history. So someone's phone can hear me right now for my at-home guests. Anyway, without further ado, I'm going to introduce tonight's speaker. Jonathan Knotek is a guide was a guide.
Still am.
Still is a guide for Chicago Pizza Tours and is a former bartender. He co-founded the Prohibition Tours in 2014. Knotek presented the idea, and after plenty of research, the original Prohibition Tours launched. Jonathan is a resident of Chicago with a huge passion for the city and a unique way to show it. With Knotek's background in tourism, he is able to deliver the ultimate guide to Chicago's Prohibition era. Everyone, please join me in welcoming Jonathan Knotek.
Good evening, everybody. How is everyone this evening? Good? All right. I will say, unfortunately, you guys here with me at the public library won't be able to indulge, but all of you at home, if you feel like cracking one open as we go along this evening, please feel free to do so. Yeah, you're going to head home? Fair enough. I completely understand. Yes, as Chris mentioned, my name is Jonathan Knotek, one of the owners and founders of Chicago Prohibition Tours, and my job is to teach people about Prohibition in Chicago, which is not just about the gangsters, which is what everybody always thinks. It's also just about the era in general, the speakeasies, the quality of booze. But tonight, specifically, what we're going to focus on is we're going to talk a little bit, we're going to do three parts, basically. We're going to talk essentially about how Prohibition came about in the first place, because that's really important to understand moving forward. We're going to talk about what the speakeasy actually was, and then we will break down the booze that was out there and available and how you could get it and things of that nature and the problems it caused or the lack thereof. Whatever, we're going to cover all that fun stuff, and then if you have questions at the end. So I'm happy to answer them. So the first thing is to understand Prohibition. It's 100 years in the making, okay? My job right now is to give you over 100 years of history in about 5 minutes, okay? So what we're gonna start off by talking about first is you have to understand the level of people or the level of alcohol that people were drinking before Prohibition began, and even as early as the founding of the United States. So we start off with American drinking habits and alcoholism, okay? So when the first sailors arrived to the New World, their cargo holds filled with rums, whiskeys, and beers. It's incredibly valuable and tradable, all right? You have the founding fathers as some of the biggest drinkers around. George Washington made sure all of his troops at Valley Forge had at least a half a cup of rum every single day. Thomas Jefferson collected and produced his own wines and whiskeys. James Madison was rumored to drink a pint of whiskey every single day. It was not uncommon to have beer with breakfast, and the best way to sum it up is that by 1830, the average American male over the age of 15 years old was consuming 88 bottles of whiskey a year, which roughly translates to about 6 shots of whiskey every single day. okay, or half as much as James was drinking, by the way, to put that into perspective. But small towns all across the United States, church bells are ringing at 11 a.m. and 4 p.m., signaling grog time. So with that level of alcohol consumption comes a huge level of alcohol abuse, okay? So that is the main thing, okay, is the amount that people are actually drinking. The next thing that we have to talk about, there's two big things that lead towards prohibition. First is the pure religiosity of it, okay? This is an immoral thing. God doesn't want you to be doing this. And so prohibition begins and always largely remains a religious movement, specifically Protestant Methodist, okay? So you have folks like Lyman Beecher here, who starts to preach for prohibition all the way back in the 1820s, all right? And then you have groups like the Washingtonians. They're a group of reformed drinkers out of Baltimore, Maryland. They start to, who incidentally meet inside of bars. They get together, swear off the alcohol, tell each other stories about their lives as alcoholics, kind of legitimately the first Alcoholics Anonymous. So you have all these groups coming along. Now the laws won't show up until Neil Dowell, the mayor of Portland, Maine, successfully lobbies the Maine legislature to pass the first dry laws, making Maine the first dry state. So the laws don't actually start to show up until the 1850s, which is also where the women get on board. But what happens in Maine is as soon as you make it illegal, people start to want to sell this illegal commodity, right, for a quick buck. And they walk up and down the streets of Portland selling swigs for $1 each. What term does that give rise to? Anyone? No. Where's she hiding the booze? Bootlegger, bootlegging. Yes, absolutely. That's where it comes from. So now this is the next main thing is the women's movement. Okay, for women, alcohol is a real problem. So you have women like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And they're preaching for basically temperance more than prohibition. So the tempering, the easing more than you just can't have it. But for women, alcohol is a real problem. Before suffrage is passed in America, women have basically no rights. You're married, kind of your husband's property. He can treat you however he wants to, beat you up. There's no concept of things like marital rape at the time. If your husband is going to treat you this way, when is he the most likely to do so? When he's drunk, yeah. And it's not just things like that. It's men even in good relationships getting their paychecks, but then going straight to the saloon and blowing the whole thing inside the saloon, leaving no money for the family. So for women, you can see how this is a huge, huge problem. And you have then the Civil War breaks out. And here's the next important thing, is you have to understand the amount of money that alcohol was making. We talked about the consumption levels, right? By the turn, or by the time the Civil War starts, the rumor is, and I've not found anything to actually fully back this up, but the rumor is that the United States was making a full 1/3 of its gross domestic product based on alcohol sales. Okay, they're not going to kill their largest cash cow fighting the largest war since the Revolution. So, and then by the turn of the century, 1820, and we're going to talk about this a little bit more later, 19th century into the 20th century, the federal government is making 30 to 40% of its annual income just off of alcohol taxes, okay? So it's a huge money driver in the United States. So it's not until after the Civil War where women I'm blanking on her name right now, but she is out of Ohio. Eliza Jane Thompson is her name. And she is bringing back that religious movement, but also the women's movement. They're praying outside of saloons and grocery stores. And then you have women like Frances Elizabeth Willard, who basically becomes head of the WCTU, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which, by the way, if you would like to join, you still can. You just take a quick trip up to Evanston, Illinois, where they are headquartered, and you can sign up for the WCTU. So you have the women's movement, but alcohol is still big business. Saloons become meeting halls for veterans groups and unions. For Carrie Nation, this becomes too much to deal with. She starts to smash up these places with a hatchet. She's going from town to town and basically breaking these places up. She's also 6'1", so she's intimidating and running at you with a hatchet. So these factors are all starting to come around. Basically, the turn of the century, you got all these things starting to happen, and that's when things really start to take off. Because although we are almost 100 years in the making at this point, we're already 80 years into this by the time folks like Carrie shows up. Alcohol is still huge business. Like I said, the kind of money that it's making. And then you have folks like the Reverend Howard Hyde Russell bringing the religious aspect back with folks like Wayne Bidwell Wheeler. But what really starts to happen is the immigrant population boom and also the brewers, okay? At the turn of the century, there's a massive influx of immigrants into the United States. And at the time, Irish, Italian, German, Polish, Czech, what do all these cultures have in common? Real good drinkers, yeah. Particularly the Germans, they're bringing it with them. You got all these immigrants coming in, and then you got folks like Miller, Blatz, Pabst, Schlitz, and who is the largest of all of them, and still is, by the way? Adolphus Busch builds the largest brewery in the Western Hemisphere. It's a 70-acre facility outside of St. Louis. It's got everything he needs to make business boom, and it's booming. He's so well known and highly regarded that on the night of his 35th wedding anniversary, there's a toast held in his honor nationwide, because the brewers actually owned the saloons back then. It's illegal to do that now in the United States for monopoly purposes, but the brewers never understood prohibition. They never saw it as a real possibility. So just to go back a little bit, we've got the money, we've got the amount that people were drinking, we have the money that alcohol was making, we have the religious movements, we have the women's movements, you have the immigrant boom, you have the rise of the brewers, and then again you have the taxes, right? So again, the money that alcohol is making. But what ends up happening is the next big thing is that the 16th Amendment is passed. Does anyone want to take a crack at what the 16th Amendment is? Someone said it. Yeah, it's the federal income tax law. So suddenly the United States government has a brand new piggy bank from which to withdraw funds. They don't need the brewers. We'll take it, but we don't need it. So the brewers lose their monetary influence, which is, as we all know, the most influential of them. So seizing on an opportunity, the groups that I just told you about, they double down their efforts. There's a march held on December 10th of 1913 on the Capitol in DC demanding an amendment to the Constitution for prohibition. The bill is introduced in both houses of Congress that same day. It's going to pass within 5 years in 1918 over Woodrow Wilson's veto. He actually tried to kill it. Maybe the one thing that dirtbag of a president did correctly. But anyway, in 1918, the brewers had been totally knocked out of the box. They got their death knell when the United States entered World War I. Against who? Germany. Guess who suddenly becomes very unpopular in the United States? All those big business German brewers. Wayne Bidwell Wheeler actually convinces Congress to open up and, whoops, it's taking a second to, there we go. Wayne Bidwell Wheeler convinces Congress to open up investigations into the brewers as spies for the German Kaiser. So he actually convinces Congress to pass a temporary ban on the sale of grain to the brewers for the war effort. So these kind of propaganda things go out, and so the brewers are pretty much totally knocked out of the box. The Dries understood it had to get done before 1920, because in 1920, a new census was going to come out that would reflect what I talked about, which is that switch from rural to urban, but again, the influx of immigrants. And once they're all counted, they're going to get representation. And once they have that, suddenly these dirty Irish, Italian, Polish, drinking Catholics are going to have a voice. We're going to be outmatched, right? And so the Wets see the writing on the wall and they propose a timeline. And they say, all right, you got Congress to sign off on this. Now you need the states to vote for it. That's a 2/3 to 3/4 state majority, 36 states, as it turns out. Go find 36 states to vote for this thing. We're going to give you 84 months to get it done, which is 7 years. Seems like a long time, right? Why would you give anyone that much time? Well, it's going to eclipse that 1920 mark. The census comes out. It's effectively dead at that point. But they also just don't see it. You're never going to find half that amount of states in any amount of time. And they vastly underestimated their competition. It took the Dries 13 months to find the 36 states needed. In just over a year, on January 16th of 1919, Nebraska became the 36th state to ratify prohibition to the Constitution. And then the law goes into effect 1 year later on January 17th of 1920. Now, can anybody tell me why January 17th of 1920 is also an important date in prohibition history? Nobody? To be fair, in 9.5 years of doing this tour, 2 people have gotten this correct, and only one of them got it entirely correct. January 17th of 1920 just so happened to be Al Capone's 21st birthday. Prohibition began on Capone's 21st birthday. Now, there are no drinking age restrictions back then, but it's still a fun little ironic coincidental fact, okay? All right, so that was about as quickly as I could sum up over 100 years of history for you right there. So you got all those factors that lead up to Prohibition. You have the religious groups, the women's groups, the immigrant boom, the anti-immigrant sentiment, World War I, the 16th Amendment. So when people ask me, well, what do you think led to Prohibition? It's not a simple answer. It's literally 100 years of history and then 5 to 10 years of things kind of happening all at the same time to create the perfect storm for Prohibition to actually take effect, okay? All right, so we're gonna talk, before we get into the Volstead Act, we are gonna talk a little bit about what the speakeasy actually was. Okay, so first of all, incredibly general in its terminology. All it means is an illegal place. That's it, okay? If you had a space and you had some booze, technically you had yourself a speakeasy. They really weren't that much more complicated than high school and college parties, if we're being honest with each other, okay? When you imagine a speakeasy, you probably imagine what it is that Hollywood puts into your head, which is the super secret room, down the super secret hallway, through the super secret door, third alley on the left, knock 3 times, right? It's largely overblown by Hollywood. There were certainly secret rooms, sure, but typically nothing more than office and storage space where they kept the extra booze hidden, maybe they kept the extra money, maybe they had meetings in there. But for the most part, the drinking's right up on the first floor, okay? Maybe you're drinking in a back room, maybe you're drinking off, maybe you're entering off the back alley. But for the most part, again, drinking's right up on the first floor, and just cover up your front windows so that nobody can see inside, all right? And I'm gonna help you compartmentalize that a little bit. Let's say that in 2019, early 2020, something weird happens. Let's call it a pandemic. And let's say that all the bars and restaurants shut down, okay? Now let's say, especially in the big cities, Chicago, Minneapolis, New York, St. Louis, wherever, there's a lot of civil unrest in those first months, especially in that first summer. And all these places board up their front windows. You think they weren't calling their friends and family and being like, nobody can see inside anyway. We're doing friends and family tonight. Come on out. Russian Division, Wrigleyville, Boys Town all got busted multiple times for running real speakeasies once again in the United States 100 years after the beginning of Prohibition. Now, it was illegal for a different reason, but you guys get my point there. Right? Okay. Now, there were also certainly secret hallways and doorways. Absolutely. But typically, they were almost always, they were escape routes, not ways to get in. And we, as the general public, would have never needed to use them. And we're going to talk about that in just a moment when we talk about what the Volstead Act actually said. Sadly, there are tours even in Chicago that will tell you that to get into speakeasies, people had to walk through sewers and pop up through manhole covers. And I have 2 words for that, bullshit. New York City, yes, bullshit is what I said, because since you didn't hear it. So New York City alone had an estimated 30,000 to 100,000 speakeasies. Chicago's number started between 10,000 and 20,000. Okay, guys, there's like 100 places we can go tonight to get a drink. 5 of them include walking through human excrement to get inside. Yeah, I'm gonna throw this out there. Could we go to any one of the 95 where that's not part of the deal, please? It doesn't make any sense. If you wanna tell me they use those as escape routes, I'm fine with that. I have no problem with that whatsoever. But again, we would not have needed to use them. And again, I'll explain that a little bit later as we go on here. Where does the term come from? So if you're going to talk about an illegal place to do anything, you're going to do it in hushed tones. Shh, speakeasy, man, speakeasy. How do you find a speakeasy? Well, much like a brothel has a red light out front, I'm told, a speakeasy has a green light, a green door, a green piece of stained glass, green signage of some kind. So again, I know what you all may be thinking, which is, hold on. So all the drinking is on the first floor, and a green whatever outside means this is a speakeasy. How in the hell is that even a little bit secret? How do the cops not know that that's there? Of course the cops knew that it was there. In many cases, incredibly well paid not to care that it was there. But more importantly, especially at the time and in the big cities, you're talking about a largely Irish Catholic police force. And the Irish viewed prohibition not only as an attack on their culture, but as an attack on their religion as well. And make no mistake about it, as much as prohibition was an anti-drinking movement, is as much as it was an anti-immigrant and an anti-Catholic movement as well. So your local sergeant, probably with a last name like O'Malley, is going to come in on a Monday and probably for a drink and say on Wednesday, we're coming. So make sure nobody important is in here. Leave us someone to drag down to the precinct and something to smash in the street so it looks like we're doing our job. You're going to have to shut down for a couple of days, but then next week, open up business as usual. I'll let you know when we're coming the next time. In the big cities especially, prohibition's a joke. And even if they wanted to enforce it, the feds left it up to the states for it all. And the state's attitude was, we don't have the money and manpower to enforce the laws that are already on the books, let alone everything it's going to take to enforce this. So prohibition is doomed to fail almost from its very beginnings. Okay? All right. Now, as I said, what I want to actually talk about is what the law said. All right. Now, it is going to be somewhat more nuanced than what I said, but essentially, what prohibition made illegal, and I know you guys can't read this, but the Volstead Act was not particularly long, but what it made illegal was the manufacture, sale, or transport of intoxicating liquor. Okay. Now, how you got your booze back then is the exact same way you would get your booze today. Legally in America today, it's a 3-tier system. You have brewers and distillers, you have distribution companies, local or national, and then you have retailers. And it is the exact same thing back then, they just went by different names. So the brewers and the distillers, the guys that could make or get the booze for you at a high level, those are largely the bootleggers. Okay. The distribution companies that can afford to buy from them, more importantly, have the organizations to get it out onto the street. Those are largely the gangsters. And then there's some crossover there. Capone, for example, is going to be both bootlegger and obviously gangster. And then there are the retailers, and those are just the speakeasies. Okay. It's really not more complicated than that. Now, a couple of weird facts about prohibition. First, not all alcohol went away. A lot of medicines were alcohol-based back then. So apparently I have a pointer here. Oh, look at that. That's fun. So you were granted, you could get medicinal alcohol, okay? And more prescriptions were written during Prohibition than in any other time in American history, okay? There are industrial reasons for alcohol. It is 2 different kinds of alcohol, but you get my point. And then, of course, there are religious reasons for alcohol. You still have to be able to produce communion wine, okay? Legally, if you want to procure it, typically you have to be one of 3 things. You have to be a doctor, you have to be a pharmacist, or you have to be a religious leader. And incidentally, Prohibition begins, and Catholic churches all across the United States start to place absolutely ridiculous communion wine orders. And when it shows up, they then just distribute it to the congregation. If you're Jewish, you want to be a rabbi, to the best of my understanding, and feel free to correct me, but you announce your intentions to become a rabbi, and then you do all the studies associated with it. So rabbis like Rabbi Shanahan start to pop up. Rabbi Calabrese, Rabbi Rodriguez, right? So, and not to say that those people don't exist, because they certainly do, but you get my point. So the booze is out there, and you can get your hands on it. But what's not in the law? What did I very specifically tell you that the law made illegal? Do you remember? Manufacture, sale, and then distribution. Say it louder. At no point during Prohibition was it ever illegal to own or to consume alcohol. If you had a huge wine cellar, whiskey collection, both, enjoy it till it runs out. Have parties. They can all enjoy it. No problem. You're not breaking the law. Remember when I said we didn't have to use the escape routes? We weren't breaking the law. If this were the 1920s right now and we were all drinking and the cops came in, we would just look and go, well, guess the party's over, slam our drinks and walk right out through the front door. No arrest, no fine, nothing. We aren't breaking the law, okay? Now, remember that there is also a full year between the passage of Prohibition and the implementation of Prohibition. So if you have some money leading up to Prohibition, what are you doing? You sure as shit are. Yeah. The Yale Club in New York City, seeing the coming of Prohibition, bought so much alcohol, it ended up lasting them the entire 13 years of Prohibition. And then they just charged exorbitant membership fees to come in and enjoy it. You're paying for the membership. The booze just happens to come along with it, which means places like the Chicago Athletic Association right here, which, by the way, that's still what it looks like. Okay, the Hyatt company came in and did a painstaking rehab of the building, and now it's totally open to the public. Highly recommend if you ever get downtown that you go over there and have yourself a drink, because they're also fantastic. But places like the Chicago Athletic Association would have been places that you could legally go, and everyone knew that you could legally go to get a drink because it was supplied by men like George Remus over here. George Remus was maybe the biggest bootlegger in America. Started off here in Chicago before he moved his empire to Cincinnati, but he was a member of the Athletic Association, and eventually when he decides to become a bootlegger, his business became so big, he was making $79,000 a day in the sale of his illegal alcohol. Now, the booze is out there, you can get it. But as I said, you typically, if you want to do it legally, you have to be one of three things. The more important thing here is, if you're talking about the Yale Club in New York or the Chicago Athletic Association back when it was, what do you imagine you needed to be or look like to get into one of those clubs?
Aristocrat.
Rich, yeah, aristocrat, absolutely. You had to be rich, and that's the really important thing here, is that if you had money during Prohibition, your life didn't change. You went to your same old clubs, right? You drank your same high quality booze, and that's the really important part. We'll talk about that in a second. It was the general public that had to go to some basement, gangster-controlled, prostitute-ridden speakeasy, which, if I'm being honest, actually sounds like a lot of fun. But my point is, again, if you had money, your life didn't change. You went to your same old clubs, you drank your same high-quality booze, especially if you're getting it from a guy like Remus. Now, or Al Capone, for example. Al Capone is also going to get you the really high-quality alcohol. Now, there's two ways that they're going to provide you with this. There's two different things happening here, okay? I want to be really clear about this, and I'll point it out with my hand. Gangster, bootlegger, okay? Distributor, provider, or manufacturer, okay? Now, Remus is going to get his booze in a really unique way, where he's a trained and licensed pharmacist. I told you that pharmaceutical alcohol was available, right? The other thing that happens is that when Prohibition begins, breweries, distilleries, wineries, they have warehouses loaded with alcohol that they can now do nothing with. They can, however, sell the property. And if they're desperate, and many of them are, they're going to sell it at a cut rate. Remus is going to snap that up. He then just can't empty the barrels because it's all federally regulated and tested. The government comes in to make sure, and still does to this day. It's where bonded liquor, or the idea of bonded liquor, comes from. But the government is going to make sure the barrels are at the percentage they should be in terms of ABV, that the alcohol is the right kind of alcohol, so on and so forth. So what's Remus going to do? Well, Remus is a trained and licensed pharmacist. So he's going to get, as I said, the permits needed to pull out the alcohol for his pharmaceutical company, have those shipments hijacked from his own men, by his own men, without the left hand knowing what the right hand is doing. And then he's going to take one of those warehouses, right? For example, Jack Daniels. He bought the Jack Daniels warehouse during Prohibition, and he's going to siphon off 20 barrels at a time, 20% at a time, and then take his raw pharmaceutical alcohol and refill those barrels. So now what he's pulled out, that's the finest quality alcohol you can get your hands on, all right? And then the alcohol he puts back into the barrel, which is ethanol alcohol, it's gonna meet the federal guidelines when it's tested, okay? So what he's providing is the best quality alcohol that you can get your hands on, and Capone is going to buy his alcohol. The other thing that happens is in terms of sourcing it, there's still plenty of places to get it in the United States, but Canada, who had tried prohibition before the United States and then decided that was stupid, when we decided we were going to do it, Canada went, we're going to make so much money. And then they built several breweries and distilleries right along the American-Canadian border, and their attitude was, get up here. We're happy to sell it to you. We don't know how you're going to get it home, but that's also not our problem. That's your problem. The UK did that with gin to the point where the United States government went to both Canada and the UK and said, please stop selling to these Americans who are bringing it back in bulk. To which they said, absolutely not. We are making a ton of money. Again, that's your problem, not our problem. Okay, so the booze is out there, but if you're not getting it from one of these two guys, or other gangsters as well, guys whose names are on the line, you better be really damn careful. Because once that booze changes hands a couple of times, the less scrupulous people are going to cut it. And they're not just going to water it down. They're going to use something that has an alcohol taste. Methanol, turpentine, formaldehyde. By the way, this picture of formaldehyde with the octopuses, that was the least gross picture I could find to put up there. Or things like straight kerosene, okay? And they're gonna put it to water down the alcohol, okay? Because they need to make it last a little bit longer, all right? It may make you go blind, and that's where the term blind drunk comes from, by the way. It may kill you. The United States government either purposely put out, or at the very least knowingly allowed to hit the streets, batches of alcohol they knew were poisoned. The idea being people would drink it, they would get sick, and they would never drink again. I'm gonna go out on a limb here and say that there's very few people in this room right now, or watching at home, that have not thrown up at one point or another from too much drinking. I'm not judging you, it's a fact. And yet here we all are. Well, not so much here, maybe you guys at home, but when you're drinking the next time, there you go. Didn't stop anyone from doing anything. What it actually did was hurt, and in many cases, kill people. Now I'm gonna ask you what's gonna sound like a stupid question. We'll go back a few. Should you drink industrial alcohols, like for example, say antifreeze?
No.
Why not?
It'll kill you.
Yeah, that's the correct answer. Yeah, it'll kill you. Now, would you be surprised to learn that up until Prohibition, not only was it perfectly fine to drink antifreeze, it was a totally legitimate substitute for regularly distilled alcohol. The government rightfully saw if people could not get their hands on regular alcohol, they would turn to industrial alcohol. So the government put in all the additives and poisons to stop people from drinking it as an alternative. Now, there is a caveat there. We are not talking about the fine-tuned pieces of machinery we have today, okay? And in and of itself, what does any alcohol not do? It doesn't freeze. All alcohol is essentially antifreeze. So the antifreezes they were using back then were much closer to potable alcohol than the synthetic antifreezes that we think of today, okay? And I'm going to talk about something in just a moment that's going to help compartmentalize that a little bit even further. Now, you can look up drinking habits pre, during, and post-Prohibition. And I'll step back so you guys here can see it, and I'll try to get out of the way of the camera here. But if we look here, you can see that there's the regular levels of alcohol. Now look, there's 1920, the beginning of Prohibition, right there. All of these things, and you've got alcohol deaths, drunkenness arrests, alcoholic psychosis, cirrhosis deaths, alcoholic consumption, and there's going to be things like cirrhosis levels in general. You can see that it all falls to damn near zero at the beginning of Prohibition, okay? Because at the beginning, it's incredibly effective. But then what you see is this sharp spike right here, right? Where it all comes up, but then it does kind of level off throughout Prohibition. So right here, right about right here is where the end of Prohibition happens, and then you can see the jump up, the steady rise. But during Prohibition, it stays fairly level, and we don't get back to those original levels except for alcoholic deaths, because drunkenness arrests go down because the consumption goes down. Consumption goes down. Psychosis takes time. Cirrhosis takes time. Alcoholism in general takes time. One glass of truly poisoned alcohol, you're done. And then we do not get back to pre-prohibition drinking levels again until basically the 1970s, okay? Now, it's gonna stay fairly level in the, well, for a little while. You can see the rises here, okay? Now, right about here, you see a drop, okay? And that's about the mid-1980s. Why does it come down in the mid-1980s? Anyone? Nope. Nope. It's the national 21 and over law gets passed, and drinking levels actually come down. Now you can see it stays fairly kind of level in the 90s. There's a slight uptick in the early 2000s, but then the younger millennials and Generation Z are the first groups to drink less than their predecessors until COVID, when consumption rates go, this is a really bad slide, I apologize, but you can see the line here. Consumption rates go through the roof across the board around the world. We are all bored, we are all stressed, and never underestimate how much going out actually curbs drinking. If you drove, you got to get back behind the wheel. Probably at least want to figure out how to get home, because then if you don't, you go for a walk and you stumble over a small fence into a park and you rip your shirt and you got to call your ex-girlfriend to come find you and you don't know how to describe where you are and she says send your location and you say you're too drunk and then she does eventually find you. But then it's the thing apparently for the rest of your life, and I'm just saying you want to avoid that. That's all I'm saying. So, and I also don't want to speak for any of you, but I cannot go out every night of the week and spend $100 to $150 on drinking. What I can do is take that same $150 and go to a liquor store and buy 5 really solid bottles of bourbon and make as many old fashions as it takes for me to consume those 5 bottles. So we are already seeing the effects of alcohol abuse because of the pandemic. All right, and then I told you I'd help compartmentalize the antifreeze thing a little bit, is when the pandemic began and all the bars and restaurants shut down, and depending on what state you live in, the liquor stores shut down as well. If you're an alcoholic that actually needs alcohol to survive, what suddenly becomes readily available literally anywhere you walk into for free?
Hand sanitizer.
Hand sanitizer. And who started to produce it all? All the distilleries and breweries. What do they produce?
You can't drink it.
Yes, you can, especially if it's coming from a distillery, which produces potable alcohol. The government had to go to them and say, you're going to have to put something poisonous in this and slap a label on it because people are drinking this and it's causing a huge problem. My point here is that if people want the booze, they will figure out how to get it one way or another. Yep. Well, but mouthwash isn't free, whereas hand sanitizer, you walk in and steal the jug and leave, right? So, all right. Now, there are 2 forms of alcohol, and unfortunately, I put the slide in the wrong place, so I apologize for that. But there are 2 forms of alcohol during Prohibition that get a really bad rap. Can you tell me what those 2 forms of alcohol are? And an unfairly bad rap, by the way. No. What kind? Bathtub gin, that's number 1. And what's the other one? I mean, it's American as apple pie.
Moonshine.
Moonshine was what I was looking for, yes. Or corn mash, yeah, you're absolutely right. But yes, moonshine or bathtub gin. Now, in and of themselves, both of these are fine, okay? They get a bad rap because what you're having is, and I'll just tell you quickly how to make both of those. All moonshine is raw corn alcohol. You put your mash together, you cook it, you let it ferment and then distill out and you have raw corn alcohol, okay? All that is raw bourbon. What creates bourbon is the barreling process, okay? And then some of the alcohol evaporates, but all moonshine is that base juice is what I like to say. Okay, and then bathtub gin, as long as you're starting with a good product, all right, a raw alcohol. In fact, here's a quick tutorial on how to do that. Go to a liquor store and buy some Everclear, which is incredibly high proof, clear alcohol. Put it into a receptacle add some juniper, cardamom, whatever you want it to taste like, add a little heat, cover it and let it ferment for about 48 hours, and then take that cover off, let it steep for another 48 hours, strain all that stuff out, you got gin. It's not real good gin, but it's gin nonetheless, and it won't necessarily hurt you, okay? The problem, okay, is that people with moonshine or with bathtub gin, they're not starting with a good product. They're starting with this. They're starting with the kerosene. They're starting with the formaldehyde. They're starting with the turpentine or the methanol, okay? So that's why the quality of booze during Prohibition, depending on where you got it from, it was really important to pay attention. And I know we like to think that maybe we shouldn't be, and we probably shouldn't, but we shouldn't be working with gangsters or things like that. Back then, that was the safest place to get your alcohol. If you knew your booze came from Capone or Bugs Moran or Dion O'Banion or Johnny Torrio or any of these guys, that's good stuff, and it's not going to hurt you. On the other hand, if you're getting your booze from the government, that might hurt you real bad. So there are good and bad booze out there. You can get the good stuff. You got to be careful with the bad stuff. But that is essentially a quick breakdown on the kind of booze that was available, where you could get it from, and the quality of it. And now I will open it up to questions, if anybody has any questions about anything. And
while you guys are thinking, I do have an online question. Remember, throw your hand in the air and I'm going to come over to you with my microphone. My online question, I don't know if you have the answer to this, Jonathan. It might just be something to pontificate on, but was it possible that the founding fathers drank so much alcohol because they had they didn't have access to clean water to drink?
Not only is that possible, it's, well, not for the founding fathers. The founding fathers would have been rich and had all the resources in the world to get clean water. Now, as far as the general public is concerned, particularly if you're traveling from Europe to the United States, yes, clean water is ridiculously hard to get your hands on back then. Okay, we all think of clean, you just go to the tap, right, and turn it on, you got yourself clean water. That's a pretty much first world thing, okay? It's still really hard to find clean water around the world if you don't live in a civilization. And so yes, that is absolutely true. The alcohols that were in all of these things would kill the bacteria, and then you could drink it and stay hydrated, because this is before people are smart and realize that alcohol in fact dehydrates you. But yeah, the answer to that question is, I don't know about the founding fathers, but using alcohol as a substitute for clean water was absolutely a thing back then. Yes.
Oh, 1 second.
We got a couple of questions.
Run up here and then I'll...
When you said if you knew where your booze was coming from, Capone or whoever, how did you know that?
That's a great question. It depends. Well, basically it's, most people are going out to get their booze and they're buying it at a speakeasy, right? And so you would have known who controlled that speakeasy, and it wouldn't have been that secretive whose spot it was. So if you could get yourself into a Capone joint or a O'Banion joint or something like that, then you know that they're, because here's the problem. It's bad enough to be breaking the law in the way that they were breaking it. It's way worse if they're killing people on top of it, right? So if you're going to a place that you know they frequent, they also are going to sell to you to bring back home. The problem is quite frankly, just like drugs today, if you're just getting it from some unscrupulous street dealer who's got, you find out someone at the end of the alley's got booze, I don't know that I would trust that. But if you're going to an actual speakeasy where you know, or at least it's rumored that the gangsters are in control of, it's probably good stuff. So word of mouth, things like that. Kind of like today. I mean, even to boil it down is, where do you get your best cuts of beef? Everyone's got an idea. You know what I mean? So.
Question over here.
Yeah.
Just wanted to know if you knew about the, God, what'd you call it? I lived on Crilly Court. I don't know if you know where that is.
I don't, I'm sorry.
1700 North LaSalle.
Okay.
And it was all connected from, I forgot the name of the streets, but from LaSalle to something underground. There were tunnels.
Sure. Yeah. So those tunnels were originally built in the 19th century as a way to transport mail and packages and coal and things like that. What they end up being is really convenient for the gangsters to have access to. So when you hear about the gangster tunnels underneath any major American city, 9 times out of 10 they existed long before Prohibition ever began. But then were utilized by the gangsters. Absolutely. Sure. Yeah. Yeah. That's what caused the Chicago flood, by the way, was those tunnels in 1993. Yeah. Construction crew. What's that?
Block city roof.
Yeah. Yeah. Right by the river. And then it emptied into those.
Well, it sounds like, you go out to dinner and you have a glass of wine. It sounds like these people were just drinking just to forget their troubles and just pass out.
Probably.
Well, in some cases, especially as you get towards the end of Prohibition, because the last 4 years of Prohibition are 1929 to 1933. What's going on then? The Great Depression. The stock market crashes and the Great Depression begins. So especially at the end, let's change that was a terrible slide to end on here. We'll end here. Yeah, they have a lot of problems that they're drinking just to forget their problems. So you're absolutely not wrong, but they're also just still going out and having fun, because one of the unintended consequences of Prohibition is Prohibition passes, and then the year it takes effect, suffrage is passed. There's a sexual revolution that happens in the 20s. The flapper becomes the fashion icon of the time period. And women want to be able to come out and have a drink just like everybody else. And for the first time, all these speakeasies are looking at the women and saying, absolutely, get in here, bring your friends. And yet, there's this weird pushback against that from men everywhere. Men look at this and go, women in the bar? No, you can't have, all right, look, that's where I'm a man. Talk about man things in there. Can't have a bunch of women running around messing with my man, I don't know. But yeah, so it's not just about drinking to forget. There's plenty of that. But there's also just drinking to have fun. And the nightclub is really born out of Prohibition. These places that were legal, right, were frequented on a nightly. There was I can never remember her name, but she wrote for, I want to say, the New Yorker, and her whole job was traveling the country and writing under a pen name about where you could get booze in America. And these were legal spots where everyone knew you could drink. So it's both. It's people drinking. It's the same as today, right?
That's a strangely good transition. We have an online question. Do you think there's ever a chance there would be a modern version of Prohibition in our lifetime? Why or why not?
I want to be careful because I don't want to get too political here. Because that's not why you guys are here. I used to think no. But some things recently have shown me that I can't take it off the table. I think it's fairly unlikely, and the reason for that is alcohol makes too much money. Now, that being said, not nearly the amount of money that it used to. So the gross domestic product of the United States today is somewhere around $25 trillion. And the sale of alcohol accounts for, I think, almost 2% of that, which is not a ton, right? You could easily get rid of that and then it's no big deal. But 2% of $25 trillion, that's a lot of money. And we're not even just talking about the federal level, we're talking about the state level as well. So I think it would be, I don't know what would have to happen for alcohol to be completely gotten rid of. What I can tell you is that, now that the pandemic has calmed down and people are calming down, we're again seeing alcohol rates drop as our younger generations aren't drinking as much because they're doing other things, quite frankly. But the alcohol rates have dropped. And so I don't think it's ever going to be a problem the way that it once was, where it needs to be. But as I said, there's been some things recently that make me think that that's not something that's completely unlikely. But I do think it's highly unlikely, which is kind of a cop-out. But yeah, but there's a reason for that. Okay, so I know where you're coming from.
Well, can you really quickly just, for our at-home audience, guest in person commented that churches had closed and liquor stores had remained open, just so everyone's on the same page.
So I know where you're going with that, because a lot of people said, oh, you mean to tell me that churches aren't vital, but liquor stores are vital? Yes, because if you're a real alcoholic, you can't just stop drinking. You need to get alcohol or you're going to die. And the government understood that. And so they kept all the liquor stores open to prevent people from dying, because you can't, if you're that level of alcoholic, you can't just quit. Your body will go into shock because it no longer naturally produces insulin. They had to keep the liquor stores open to prevent deaths. Well, there you go. See, you learned something tonight. So there you go. Excellent.
Can you comment on the fact that in Europe they let kids drink before they drive?
I certainly can, and I think that's a brilliant idea. Because and I had recently someone from France, a reporter from France, come to do a story about our tour. And yeah, drinking with the family at family meals in Europe is totally normal. Wine with dinner, I mean, as early as 5, 6, 7 years old, a little glass of wine with whatever. It's not crazy, but what that does is by the time they're teenagers, it's not the crazy thing that I'm not allowed to do that I'm gonna go out and do, right? If prohibition teaches us anything, is that the pure prohibition of anything doesn't work. If people want it, they're gonna figure out how to get it. And it's much better to do it in a safe way than it is to make it completely illegal, and then they figure out how to do it illegally, and then they're drinking turpentine or whatever the case may be. So that's why Western Europe, now Eastern Europe is a completely different story, but Western Europe in particular has really low rates of alcoholism and alcohol-related death because they're eased into it. And so it's not as big of a deal when they become older, because it's not something that they feel like they're doing because it's wrong and they shouldn't be doing it. They're allowed to do it. So it actually stems a lot of that stuff.
Any questions from our in-person audience? I can run over to you. Oop, 1 second. I'm coming.
Okay, during Prohibition, the distilleries, breweries, wineries, were they shut down completely or partially or not at all, or what was their status?
It's both. As far as the distilleries went, a lot of them were granted medicinal licenses to be able to produce alcohol for medicinal purposes. The breweries did get some of that, but the breweries simply switched into making root beers. Anheuser-Busch made ice cream during Prohibition, and some of them just continue to produce illegal booze. Leinenkugel's up in northern Wisconsin got busted at least twice for continuing to produce booze. So the ones that end up shutting down were the small guys. So for example, you guys probably don't realize this, but Peoria, Illinois, before Prohibition, was one of the best places to get bourbon anywhere in the United States of America. They had several distilleries, and Prohibition completely destroyed that. So it depends. If you're one of the big guys like your Heaven Hill or your Buffalo Trace or Old Forester, Wild Turkey, they could get medicinal licenses. Your big brewers, like all the guys I mentioned earlier, they were big enough where they could switch into other things, but the smaller guys did largely fail. So it's the short answer to your question, it's both. Some got shut down, some continue to operate, sometimes illegally or sometimes just switching to other things.
Jonathan, I know I emailed you and asked you this, but since we are in a library, would you mind telling our audience some of the books that you recommended for continuing education on this topic? And I'm also going to warn everybody, these books are already checked out, but we do have them in our collection.
Yeah, which is great. That means that people are interested in it. But the number one book that I recommend is called Last Call. It's by an, I was going to say artist, an author named Daniel Okrent. He was the editor of the New York Times for a time. And he wrote a comprehensive history on Prohibition throughout the United States, not just here in Chicago. So that would be my first one. And then you have books like, my favorite book about Capone, for example, is called Capone, Life, Legend, and Legacy. It's a fantastic book. It's a really in-depth look into him, and I think you're going to be surprised with some of the stuff you learn about him, because we have this very Hollywoodized version of who he was. And then there's books like The King of the Bootleggers, which is about George Remus, who I talked about earlier. That's a fantastic book that tells his history, which starts here in Chicago. He's a really fascinating guy. And there's a bunch of other books as well, but those would be the three that I recommend. Last Call to get an idea of what Prohibition was. And then if you want to learn about Capone and the outfit and the gangsters, the Capone Life, Legend, and Legacy. And then if you want to just learn about bootlegging, King of the Bootleggers, which is about George Remus. And you had a question over here. So hold on one second so that you can, yeah.
What were the actual years of Prohibition?
Prohibition goes from January 17th of 1920 to December 5th of 1933. So it's about a month short of a full 13 years. Yeah.
How did it end?
What caused it to end?
Well, again, it's not as simple as one thing. I will say the most important thing for why Prohibition ended was the stock market crash and the Depression. Because the attitude was, if we make booze legal again, we are going to put thousands of people back to work. Because remember, it's not just the breweries, which employ or distilleries, which employ hundreds of people. It's all the saloons and bars and restaurants. It's the trucking, the ice houses, all that stuff. There's many spokes to that wheel. And then you have the money. What FDR uniquely had the ability to do was go to the entire country and say, not only are we going to put thousands of people back to work, we're going to tax the hell out of this thing and get that much needed income as well. You have the women's movement where they come 180, where they're all for Prohibition, and now they're saying, well, if we can drink legally, this is a lot of fun. I would love to do it legally. And then what FDR does is call an emergency session of Congress, because if you can get 2/3 of the Congress to vote for something, you don't need the states to vote for it. And that's what he's able to do. And then you had another question as well? Oh, that was it? Okay. Yeah, it was officially repealed.
By the states, though.
Oh, no. Just, yeah, just an emergency. Yeah, it happened like that. I mean, it's, as long as it took for Prohibition to happen is as quickly as it went away. Yeah.
Online question, was there a lot of wine drinking during Prohibition?
Well, yes and no. There was communion wine out there, and because wine has religious implications, every family in America was allotted a certain amount of wine every year. One of my favorite things is grape growers would put out a concentrate. It was a brick, okay? It was a concentrate of wine. And it would have a very specific set of steps to absolutely not do, because you might make wine. Okay, now here's the thing. We don't want to make wine, so definitely don't follow this very specific set of steps, because if you do that, you're going to accidentally make wine. So there was wine consumption during Prohibition, but the reality is there is only one thing to do with wine grapes, and that is to make wine. And vineyards die off by the acre because there's nothing to do with them at that point. So Prohibition, in terms of any of the alcohols, wine is the one that is the most negatively affected. And that's partly why the United States is so far behind the rest of the world in wine production.
Do you know what those very specific steps are?
I
to
don't.
not create?
No. Unfortunately, I don't. Yeah, exactly. Another question over there? No? Okay.
I want to make sure I'm respectful of time. We still have a little bit.
Don't worry about me. This is what's on my schedule. So,
Perfect.
yeah.
What is your just most favorite weird fact about Prohibition or the whole jazz era in Chicago?
Sure. It used to be, because I obviously didn't know, well, I didn't know this before I started to do the research. It used to be that at no point was it illegal to drink alcohol or own alcohol. That used to be my favorite weird fact. I think it's somewhat more complicated than that, in that what I find really interesting now, after almost 10 years of doing this, is how long, as you said, how long Prohibition actually lasted, okay? I totally get how it happened, but how it lasted for 13 years, and then it took the Depression to get us out of it. That's what still to this day boggles my mind, that at no point someone looked at this and said, this isn't working, and we need, yeah, we need to get rid of this. It's not working, and people are dying because they're getting bad booze. So that's, I think, the weirdest thing. I'm trying to think if there's any other specific thing that really jumps out at me, and it's because everything else kind of makes sense to me. The rise of the gangsters, right? Well, if you take away a mark, and by the way, this is what gets me in trouble. I'm pretty liberal, but this is what gets me in trouble with my more liberal friends. When I say the prohibition of anything does not work, I apply that to everything. And I won't, hopefully you have figured out what I'm talking about right now, because if you create a black market for something, then you let the criminals be in control of that. What I am for is universal common sense laws. We won't get into all that, but everything kind of makes sense to me, except for the fact that it lasted so long. But everything else, I kind of, yeah, makes sense.
Any other questions from our in-person audience? Ooh.
Is there a difference between medicinal alcohol and any other kind of alcohol, or is it just the name?
It's pretty much just the name, because basically what you need for medicinal alcohol, there's two different, well, I think there's more than two, but there's ethanol alcohol and methanol alcohol. So first of all, let's be very clear about this. All alcohol on any level is really bad for you, just to be clear on this, okay? That includes ethanol alcohol. But medicinal alcohol is meant to be ingested, right? So it's made with ethanol alcohol. So it's not really that there's a huge difference. It's that there were lower levels of it in medicines, and then there were other things that went into it. You know, a lot of, especially back then, we're not talking about the pharmaceuticals that we have today. These pharmacies back then were just this side of snake oil salesmen, if we're being honest. So it was starting with an alcohol base and then putting in botanicals, things that were thought to help you. It's incidentally, gin was sent out with the Navy because it was thought to have medicinal properties. And then you combine it with things like lime and tonic, which are also thought to have medicinal properties. So my favorite one is, for example, Malort. You guys are all from the Chicago area. Do we know what Malort is? It's a Swedish liqueur. I can't recommend it. It's horrible. And the joke was that they were granted medicinal, and whether they were or not, I don't know. But the joke was that they were granted a medicinal license, because if anyone ever stopped them and said, "What is this?" and tried it, they would say, "Well, no one would drink that on purpose, so that must be medicinal." So in terms of what it is at its base, there's not a huge difference in terms of the alcohol used in medicines. It's just that the medicinal was at a lower level in whatever the medicine was. For example, you can get drunk off cough syrup. You got to drink a lot of it. I don't recommend it. I'm just saying it can happen. So,
Jonathan, I want to just wrap with one final question.
Sure.
And it's a weird question to ask in this situation, but I try, if I can, to ask all of my speakers this question.
can't wait.
How would you say that, you know, after throwing yourself into this field and this study and learning all this about Prohibition, what things have you taken away from learning about this historical event that affect the way you live your everyday life, if any?
It's a really good question. Two things. When I was going through school, as much of a history nerd as I clearly am, when I was going through school, I always wondered, how true was it, the old saying, if you do not understand or study history, you are doomed to repeat it? It's as true as anything I have ever found in my life. Having studied this and now looking at things like fentanyl in drugs, it's the exact same thing as Prohibition. And the other thing, and it's another cliche, it's an old adage, but it's also very true, is that if you look at Prohibition and you look at today and all the things that go with it then and everything that's happening today, as much as things change is as much as they stay exactly the same. We have learned very few lessons from Prohibition or history in general, which is really, really sad. So unfortunately, I would like to say that what I learned is something enlightening and like, oh, this is great, we're doing a lot better. Yeah, unfortunately, not. Yeah.
Well, on that note, Jonathan, thank you so much for being with us this evening.
My pleasure.
I want to thank everyone for coming out tonight and spending some time here at the library with us. And of course, thank you to our online audience as well. For our in-person audience, please have a safe drive home this evening. And for our online audience, have a safe time logging off. We'll see you next time, everyone.
That was very good.
As a benefit to all of you.